is, how do we know that Jesus is who he said he was? That's a pretty good question, right? And that's one that people have struggled with throughout history. How do we know that Jesus is who he said he was? And how do we know that Jesus is the only way? I mean, it could be, couldn't it, that there's Jesus and then there's other things. So whichever way makes sense to you, seems to be best, follow that path and it'll get you, all gets us to the same place. And then the question, what if we're wrong? What do we do then? And I think it's really a great group of questions to ask and to think about and to answer. Now, before I get into it, though, I just was in my dad's house last week, and I walked in, he was watching this movie, and it turns out it's the movie The Case for Christ. Have any of you seen The Case for Christ movie? Lee Strobel is kind of the director of it, and it's on Netflix now, which I didn't know, but I watched it. Sean and I watched it this week, and it's pretty good. I'm going to just take a minute and let you watch the trailer of that Netflix TV show. I would really encourage you to watch it. It's not quite 2 hours, but it's really a nice, it's a great program. And also, because Lee Strobel directs it, I have a little bit of confidence it's pretty accurate to what actually happened. It's actually the story of his journey. Lee Strobel was a reporter in Chicago, and he was an atheist, and his wife got saved, and then it's his journey from atheism to Christianity. So just watch this trailer. Maybe we could turn those upper lights off in these spots, and let's watch that trailer.
If somebody wanted to do an investigation into Christianity, where would you start?
If the resurrection of Jesus didn't happen, it's a house of cards.
You sure you want to give me that loaded gun?
I'm pretty sure you're not going to be able to pull the trigger.
I've spent my entire career as a journalist uncovering the truth until the day my wife presented me with the biggest story of my life.
I'm not gonna lose my wife and my kids to something that I can't even reason with.
And what happened next changed me forever.
How can we even talk about historical evidence for the resurrection?
The Gospels are filled with contradictions.
The empty tomb is based on evidence. And isn't evidence your trade?
We all bet our lives on something.
The question is, what's it gonna be?
As much as I would like to help out a fellow skeptic, what you're proposing is impossible.
Could Jesus survive being spiked to the cross?
There is no evidence of anyone ever surviving a full Roman crucifixion.
Just because I write something down and I bury it in the dirt, that doesn't make it true.
What I felt was something more real than anything I've ever felt in my life.
I'm praying for you.
Do you really want to know the truth, or is your mind already made up?
Stop blaming me and the church and God and do your job.
No one's ever proven if the shroud is the actual burial cloth of the Christ. But whenever someone looks in those eyes for the first time, suddenly becomes a real person.
Anyone in the family could watch this. This is really good. It's just really it's a good movie. I found it sort of emotional. Of course, I mean, I probably cry through SpongeBob now. I don't know, but it's just like this journey of this skepticism and the pain that caused. And that's not that confusing when we recognize that this is, and if you come from a family that is divided, where some in the family are believers in Christ and are Christians, and some don't believe, they are atheists, or even just that they're skeptics or agnostics or whatever, it can be really painful. But what we're told right from the beginning of the Gospel of John is who Jesus is, right? This is where we go. It says in the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but he came to bear witness about the light, the true light, which gives light to everyone, and was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we've seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness about him and cried out, "This was the one of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me. For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace." So we have this message that comes to us. And this is key. Actually, next week we're going to talk about the differences between Christianity and some other religions, particularly ones that are prominent here. Mormonism, we'll talk a little bit about Islam. But when we think about Jesus as the eternal God, this is where the differences start to come in. Right? This is where the thing breaks down in terms of, are all religions the same? What Jesus said about what Scripture says about Jesus is that he's the way, that he's actually God, and he's the way. And then when we look at history and we look at the words of the eyewitnesses and we look at the words of Jesus himself, we realize that Jesus really comes at this very, very specifically to say, it's about me. Now, most of us shouldn't say that, right? It's about me, but Jesus does say it, because it is actually about him. And he doesn't give us a lot of wiggle room to go, well, it could be this or it could be that or it could be another thing. C.S. Lewis wrote the following in Mere Christianity, which really has become an argument that many people make, that Jesus was who he said he was. Lewis makes this point. Some call it the trilemma. He says, "I'm trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him, Jesus. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would be either a lunatic, on the level with a man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He's not left that open to us. He did not intend to. Now it seems to me obvious that he was neither a lunatic nor a fiend, and consequently, however strange or terrifying or unlikely it may seem, I have to accept the view that he was and is God." And so that's where we are. And that's where Lewis was. Lewis himself was a skeptic. Lewis was an atheist, and his journey was very similar to Lee Strobel's. That he came at this from this place of saying there is no God. And Lewis had a lot of broken stuff in his life early on, and stuff that caused him to say, I can't believe this, can't be true. But as he began to dig into it, he came to this place where he just said, I just don't know what else to do. If we come back to Lewis's basic argument, this is what it is. First, Jesus claimed to be God. His claim is either true or false, all right? It comes down to kind of that simplicity, doesn't it? Jesus claims to be God. His claim is either true or false. Listen, we think about truth, and we do live in a relativistic society, kind of a postmodern society, but I want to push you just a little bit to say, Jesus can't be both God and not God at the same time. Now, Jesus was both God and man at the same time. Now we're talking about his nature, but we can't say, well, some people say Jesus is God, and that's great, and some people say he's not, and that's great. Either was or he wasn't. That's what Lewis is saying. So if what he said is true, then he is God. And if the claim is false, then either he said it knowing it was false, right? In which case he's a liar, or he said it not knowing it was false, and then he's mad, right? You think about the people who are locked up in places in mental institutions because they think they're God, right? If you think you're God and you're not, that's a problem. Incidentally, if you're here today and you think you're God, you're not. So it just doesn't work that way. Therefore, we're left with three logical options. He is either God, or he's a liar, or he's a lunatic. Now, a lot of folks have challenged this and said, well, those aren't the only options to us, right? There aren't only three options available to us, Lord, liar, or lunatic. there could be other options available to us as well. What are the other possible options? Well, one is that the whole thing is a legend. Another is that Jesus may not have claimed to be the Son of God. When we think about legend, they say, well, the legend just rose up over time. People continued to pursue him, and so over time, even though he was just a great guy and he was really smart and he did really good things and he cared for people well, we always remember people like a little bit different than they were, right? Have you ever been to a funeral and people are talking about the person at the funeral and you like suddenly wonder, am I in the right place? That guy didn't seem that nice to me, but maybe, right? But that's the idea that legend is. It's like, they just kept talking about him, and then they started making stuff up, and then they said it over and over till they believed it. One of the problems with legend theory is that there actually isn't enough time for legend to crop up when they're saying what they're saying about Jesus. And we'll get into that a little bit. By the way, I'm just going to run you through a lot of information. So later on, if you want to get copies of my notes or copies of this slide outline, you certainly can get it. Or the idea that Jesus, may not have claimed to be the Son of God. They said he said that, but he didn't actually say that. Maybe Jesus was just being metaphoric, right? Maybe he was just telling stories, and that's really what he was up to. That's an option as well. Or maybe this one. I kind of like this one. It's moral to tell a lie if it's in the best interest of the people you're telling it to. Okay. Here's the point that the philosopher makes. Anne Frank said there were not people living in her attic during World War II. She was a woman who was, her family was sheltering Jews in her attic. And so when somebody knocked on the door and said, "Are you sheltering Jews here?" she says, "No, we're not." So that's the idea that was brought up. It's okay to tell a lie if it's morally justifiable by the importance of what you're trying to protect. So you have that idea. If it's for a good cause. It's tough to go on that one. I'm not sure how quickly you go. I mean, it seems pretty clear if you're Anne Frank, okay, we got it. But what else, has to come into that? And then the idea here that Jesus didn't exist at all. That Jesus actually didn't even exist at all. That's what one writer says is this. Well, I think the likeliest answer to this is that Jesus really didn't exist at all. The whole thing is made up. And so it doesn't matter. He's not Lord, liar, or lunatic because he's actually made up, And so it doesn't really matter what we say about it. And I think there are times when Christians are charged with the idea that we only accept Jesus by faith, right? We don't have any evidence for it. We just have to go, okay, I got to believe it, so I guess I'll believe it because I don't want things to go badly for me. And so we kind of come to this place of this fideistic idea that I'm just going to believe it and that's going to make it true. That there's no evidence of Jesus' life, his death, his resurrection. You just have to accept it. And sometimes we ourselves suggest that faith is something we just have to believe without evidence, don't we? I mean, we cite Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1 that says, "Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen." If you don't know what the text means, it could sound like this is really wishful thinking about something we have no evidence for. Like we really want it to be true, but we can't see it, so therefore it must not be true. We're hoping for things that we can't see. We're hoping for things for which there is no evidence. And while that's not actually the case necessarily, that we have no evidence, there is a philosophical concept made popular by Alvin Plantinga, which is called properly basic belief. Alvin Plantinga is a pretty solid guy, and he has this idea. He actually says it's okay if you simply believe things and there's a clear reason to believe them like this. Like there's a large body of people who do believe it. There are people that you're in your right mind. You can believe something without evidence, and it can actually be true even if there is no evidence. Essentially, properly basic belief in God would say that a thing can be said to be true if it is self-evident or evident to the senses, if it is reasonable and consistent with the sensible worldview. So if we wanted to way oversimplify this, we might be able to say, in general, the world tells us there is a God. Right? Most people believe there's a God. In fact, almost all people from the beginning of time have believed there's a God. Everyone worships. We worship in different ways, and we worship different gods, but there's something in us that tells us there's something bigger than us, and there's something outside of us. What Plantinga is saying is that's obvious to the senses from almost all of history. which is to say, atheism is something that you actually sort of have to build in. You have to come to faith in that too, right? To look at the world and say, it's more likely that there isn't a designer than that there is, just isn't the case. Most people look at the world and say, somebody did this. In the same way that most people look at a piece of art and say, I wonder who painted that. I wonder who built that. I wonder who designed that. Design and the presence of God is inherent in the universe, in the world, in history. Almost all people of all times have believed that there's a God. And if you think about this, almost all the people in history who do believe in God or have believed in God, and almost all the people in history who have believed in Jesus Christ have done so with no evidence. Think about that. It's one of the things I learned in my apologetic program, right? I remember William Lane Craig, who's in the movie. He's not in the movie, but his character's in the movie we were just talking about. I remember William Lane Craig when I was taking a class on the resurrection. He said, okay, we're going to get into the evidence of the resurrection, but here's what I want to tell you before I get into the evidence. Almost all the people in the history of the world who've accepted Jesus and given their lives for him and followed him to the grave had no shred of evidence whatsoever. Doesn't mean there isn't evidence. It's just that most people don't come to Christ because of evidence. Most come to Christ because of the sense and the clarity that exists. When somebody says to them, this is what's happened in the world, and they say, yes, I believe that. And so Alvin Plantinga would call that properly basic belief, right? That people know that it's true, even without having evidence that it's true. But again, that doesn't mean there isn't any evidence about Jesus. And so let's follow some arguments down the track. We're going to start with the words of history, and then we're going to move on to the words of the eyewitnesses, and then we're going to go on to the words of Jesus himself. So, what are the words of history that we have? Because I would actually like to put forth the idea that it's actually more unreasonable to believe that Jesus didn't exist as a person than it is to believe that he did exist. In other words, for the philosopher who says, I think the most likeliest answer is that Jesus didn't exist at all. To say that Jesus doesn't exist at all as a human person in history is not very reasonable that's not a very reasonable claim on the basis of evidence. Like if you just throw out the Bible, throw out believers, throw out crazy Christians, and just look at history, it would be more unlikely that Jesus didn't exist than that he did, because we have actually a lot of evidence for Jesus' existence. Let's start with like non-Christian sources. Maybe you think that the only place that we learn about Jesus is in the Bible, but that's not actually true. There are many non-Christian sources that would definitely point to the existence of Jesus as a person. I'm not going to get into all of them. I'm probably going to get into more of them than you want. But there are more still that you could find. There's lots of stuff out there. A surprising amount, really. And some of this, and a chunk of this actually comes from people who were very contemporary to the situation. That is to say, we're not talking about people who lived 500 or 600 years later. We're talking about people who would have been contemporaries even with the disciples. The first person I want to cite is Tacitus. And he was a first century Roman historian, and he gives this account of the great fire in Rome, which everyone kind of blamed on Nero, but then Nero blamed it on the Christians. This is what Tacitus writes about that. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures of a class hated for their abominations, called Christians, by the populace. Christus, that's Latin for Christ, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurers, Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, resurrection, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. So Tacitus is writing this report about the fire that's in Rome. Nero's trying to blame the Christians, and so he's telling us about this. Nero's trying to get rid of the Christians. He's blaming the great fire of Rome on them, and so he's killing them by the dozens, by the hundreds. And he comes, and so Tacitus writes this story about it. This Christ who was crucified by Pontius Pilate, but then there's this mischievous rumor that rose up, that he rose from the dead. Look, this isn't a Christian source, right? This isn't Tacitus secretly being a Christian trying to infiltrate the Roman government. This is him writing a history of what happened. The next person is Suetonius, who is the chief secretary to the Emperor Hadrian. He lived in 117 to 138. So again, think about this. John died in 90 or something, somewhere around in there. Suetonius is writing 117 to 138. He's alive at that point. You have people who knew the disciples who were still alive. You didn't have any of the disciples probably alive when Suetonius is writing, but you have the disciples who knew people who knew about Jesus, probably. And so we have this. Because the Jews at Rome caused continuous disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, that is Christ, another spelling, he expelled them from the city. After the great fire at Rome, punishments were also inflicted on the Christians, a sect professing a new and mischievous religious belief. Like, it's mischievous to say that someone rose from the dead. This is a big problem for Suetonius, a big problem for the Roman historians. And they're addressing this in the culture. Again, this is completely outside of any kind of biblical record. So you have references to Christ, you have references to Jesus' death. In fact, you have reference close enough that it's actually calling out who was in charge of his death, which is Pontius Pilate. And then you have this idea that, okay, there was another story that kind of came up that was a little bit quirky. We're going to call it mischievous. So I just want to say, in view of this, just this, to say, oh, come on, Jesus didn't even exist, is really trying to pretend that something doesn't exist that actually does exist. Another source is Josephus. Probably a lot of you know Josephus. Josephus was a Jewish historian. He lived from 37 or 38 AD to 97 AD or AD 97. And he wrote what's called the Antiquities, and that dates back to about the 90s, right? Sometime in there. Now, Josephus is pretty common. Christians know about Josephus. But again, he never claimed to be a Christian, and the likelihood is that he wasn't. But here's part of what he wrote. He said, now it was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was one who wrought surprising feats. He was the Christ. He appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold. These and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him in his Antiquities 18:3. Now, some people have said, well, it's unlikely that Josephus really said this because Josephus never claims to be a Christian, and here he calls Jesus the Christ. Well, there's another version of Josephus's history, and it's in Arabic. It's written in Arabic, and this is what his says. This is what that translation says. Here's what they think. As text passes down, it's copied from place to place to place, and sometimes people add a little bit or change a little bit, and that's what they think happened in that first version. But here's an Arabic copy, and they think this is actually more likely closer to what Josephus wrote. It says it this way. At this time, there was a wise man named Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. But those who became his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. But the point here is just kind of simple, isn't it? That we have a lot. Now, think about Josephus. Josephus is absolutely contemporary to the time of Jesus. Now, the likelihood is he's born sometime after Jesus has died and raised from the dead. But certainly Josephus is acquainted with the disciples. He's acquainted with the Jews who are a part of this. It's just interesting that we have this. We have another history from a guy by the name of Thallus. Now, we don't have any of his actual works left, but what we do have is people referring to his works. And one of those people is named Julius Africanus. And he wrote in about AD 221. So he's writing later, but still by then, apparently, they've got either some of the work of Thallus or it's been passed down. And this is Julius Africanus writing in AD 221. On the whole world, there pressed a most fearful darkness, and the rocks were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. This darkness, Thallus, in the third book of his history, calls, as appears to me without reason, an eclipse of the sun. Okay, remember when Jesus dies, the sky turns black, there's this earthquake, the veil of the temple is rent in two, And Julius Africanus is writing about this sometimes later, but he's citing a contemporary source of when this happened. And so we see that. Another person that we can look to, his name is Pliny the Younger, and he writes in AD 112, and he's writing a letter to the Emperor Trajan, and he's describing early Christian habits of worship, right? And this is what he says. They were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light. Then they sang in alternate verses, a hymn to Christ as to a God, and bound themselves by a solemn oath not to do any wicked things, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor to deny trust when they should be called upon to deliver it up, after which it was their custom to separate and then reassemble to partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind. Right? So he's talking here about the habits of the disciples, of the Christians, and he's pointing this out. So we have a lot of work here that points us back to some of the work that was done, early historic work. To say Jesus doesn't exist is really a challenging thing to try to say. To say that he wasn't killed, that he didn't raise from the dead, they're even getting pointed back to that by some of the historic documents that would be considered authoritative. The last one that I'm going to cite for you is from the Jewish writing, from the Talmud, from the Tanaitic period. And this is, again, these are Jewish people writing. This isn't Christians. These guys had nothing, they weren't in favor of Jesus. But it says, on the eve of Passover, Yeshua was hanged. For 40 days before the execution took place, a herald went forth and cried, he's going forth to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. And remember some of the things that Jesus did. He turned water into wine, right? He multiplied fish and loaves. He raised the dead. They thought of this as sorcery, right? This guy's crazy, and that's why they killed him. Anyone who can say anything in his favor, let him come forward and plead on his behalf. But since nothing was brought forward in his favor, he was hanged on the eve of the Passover. And so you have this history that's going on, this history that's unfolding, and people know about it. And this is the point that Paul's making in 1 Corinthians 15, when he says that in verse 6, he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Right? And so one of the greatest evidences of the existence of Christ and of his life is actually the church itself. That the church, and this is a non-Christian evidence, right? Because we're here. We're here a couple thousand years later. How are we still here? What Paul's saying is, hey, Jesus rose from the dead. It's true. You don't have to believe me. Most of the people who saw him are still alive. Go and ask them. And so many of those people would have still been alive at the time these historians were writing. And so the church is still around. The church is a non-Christian evidence for Jesus and his existence. These are historical facts and historical realities that you simply have to address. So if you want to say something like, well, I think the most likeliest thing in the world is that Jesus didn't even exist, then you have to follow this path. You've got to explain how these non-Christian historical facts and writings record about Jesus. And so we understand that history tells us that Jesus did in fact exist. History tells us it's likely the early disciples did believe he raised from the dead. That's what they were talking about, to the point that it got passed around and people were paying attention to it. What about the words of the eyewitnesses? What do we have from them? And so when you think about the existence of Jesus and the eyewitnesses, the people who recognized it, one of the things we have to think about right off is, what do you do with people like James or Paul? Think about, James was the brother of Jesus. James was not a disciple. He was not a believer before the resurrection that we're aware of. It surely doesn't appear that he is. But he's a leader of the church in Jerusalem after the resurrection, right? James is the brother of Jesus. He doesn't believe in Jesus before the crucifixion, but he does believe in Jesus after the resurrection. And he actually becomes a leader in the church. And you can read about him in the book of Acts, chapter 15, where they're having this church council. And James is there, and he's not only there, but he's leading the church. It's interesting too, by the way, another archaeological thing that has been unearthed is the ossuary of James. And they really do think it's the ossuary of James. And what it is it's a small box. And it was a box that they would put a body in a tomb, like Jesus was, in a cave. And as soon as all the body decomposed and there was nothing left but bones, they'd gather up the bones, they would put them in the ossuary, and they would bury that. That would be the thing that they saved. So they think they found the ossuary of James. It's got a Christian symbol on it. They really do. It really does seem likely that James became a follower of Jesus. You remember there's a period of time when James and his mother are outside when Jesus is talking, right? He's talking to a group of people, and it says that his mother's in Mark chapter 3, verse 31 through 35. And it says his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him, and a crowd was sitting around him. And they said to him, your mother and your brothers are outside seeking you. And he answered them, who are my mother and my brothers? And looking at about those who sat around him, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of God, he is my brother and sister and mother. Think of the implication of what's going on here. First of all, Mary and the brothers are outside calling to him. But they're not inside. They're not a part of the group. And then he refers to who his mother and brother and sister is, people who are within the kingdom. And so he even excludes them from that. And so we see that James, who's the brother of Jesus, a leader of the church, doesn't believe in Jesus before his death, but after the resurrection, he's a leader in the church. And we all know about Paul. Paul's a violent persecutor of the church prior to seeing Jesus risen from the dead. And the rest is history, right? Paul's on his way on the road to Damascus, and then he meets this vision of the risen Jesus, and he becomes a believer. Those are again documented historical things, people that we have to work. You have to work it out. How do you answer How do you answer the question of the resurrection apart from looking at these guys again? What caused them to change their mind and to be converted? It wasn't just that suddenly, they thought, well, maybe we should join this group. Maybe it'd be more fun than not being a part of the group. That's not what happened. When we think about the people that we know who are right with Jesus, when John the Baptist comes into the story, Jesus comes on the place, and it says that the next day in John chapter 1, verses 29 through 31, the next day he saw Jesus coming toward him and said, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. This is he of whom I said, after me comes a man who ranks before me, because he was before me. I myself didn't know him, but for this purpose I came baptizing in water, that he might be revealed to Israel. So John comes along. John recognizes Jesus as the Messiah. And then the disciples. What do the disciples actually say about Jesus? When he says to the disciples in this moment, okay, people say I'm lots of things, but who do you say I am? In Matthew 16. Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? And they said, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. He said to them, but who do you say that I am? Simon Peter replied, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. What does Jesus say back to Simon Peter? Jesus says this, and these are, here we have now the words of Jesus, his own words about himself. When Simon Peter makes that profession, Jesus says this, and Jesus answered him, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Then he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ. So first we look at history, the words of history, the non-Christian history, and we look at some of the early people in history. We look at the words of the eyewitnesses, those who saw and those who were changed by the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, those who were changed by Jesus' message, and who actually said, no, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And you have Jesus saying, yeah, you're right about that. Now, it was still early, right? So don't tell anyone, because we're in enough trouble as it is, but don't tell anyone. But as we continue on with the words of Jesus, we find in Luke chapter 19, verses 35 through 40, this is the triumphal entry. And I think this is a key piece, because in the triumphal entry, you remember, we were singing about it, that Jesus is coming down the road. They put Jesus on a donkey. He's coming down the road. And the people are worshiping him. And some of the Jews get uptight about this, as you would get uptight if someone was worshiping someone as God who wasn't God. And they say, Jesus, you need to stop your disciples from saying this. And here's the account in Luke 19. It says, and they brought it to Jesus, and this is a donkey, and throwing their cloaks on the colt, they set Jesus on it. And as he rode along, they spread their cloaks on the road. As he was drawing near, already on the way down the Mount of Olives, the whole multitude of his disciples began to rejoice and praise God with a loud voice for all the mighty works that they had seen, saying, Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest. And some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to him, Teacher, rebuke your disciples. And he answered, I tell you, if these are silent, the very stones will cry out. What is Jesus saying? Jesus saying, I am who they say I am. Now, some people could come along and say, well, Jesus didn't really say those things. Okay, but you have to be able to make a case for him not saying those things. Even Christian scholars have actually come along and said, well, Jesus probably didn't really think of himself as that, and it's not really important that he, rose from the dead and that sort of stuff. And some of his words were probably added in and they weren't real. But you have to make a pretty solid case for that. And the vast body of scholarship says, Jesus said these things about himself. We know what history says about him. We know what the eyewitnesses say about him. And we know what Jesus says about himself. And so the question that we have to kind of wrestle with is, what do we say about Jesus? History is pretty clear what it says about Jesus, that Jesus was the Son of God, that he was crucified by Pontius Pilate because he claimed to be the Messiah, that he did these wonderful things, that 3 days after his death, he was raised again and showed himself alive to more than 500 people, and that story got passed down, and we're here today because that story got passed down. You could say, yeah, but it's still hard to believe. Yeah, it is hard to believe. Don't you once in a while go, what if this isn't true? I mean, sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night. I always wake up in the middle of the night, but sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night, I think, oh boy, I've been at this for more than 30 years. Boy, I hope this is true. Right? Can I just invite you to be comfortable with your doubt? Now, I don't mean that you just become the skeptic, but what I mean by that is it's okay to go, gosh, I need to take another look at this, and I need to dive a little deeper. Doubt is what spurs us on to learn, to grow, to think. But when you go back and you kind of stack up the evidence, where does it lead? Here's what I think. It's much, much more likely than not. In fact, it probably could be said to be evidentially true that Jesus did live, that he did miraculous things, that he did claim to be the Son of God. We certainly believe that he died and that he rose again, and that is what's true about him. And so the question is, what if we're wrong? Well, what's the worst that could happen if we're wrong? I want to invite you to think about this just a little bit. There's a guy by the name of Blaise Pascal. Do you remember him? He was a French philosopher, mathematician, and physicist. He lived from 1623 to 1662. And he kind of came up with what we call now Pascal's wager. And it essentially says this: what do we do if we're wrong? Well, if you look at the picture on the board there, what do you do with your life if on the wager God exists? If God exists, and then what do you do so the left side is, is it your left? Yeah. On the left side is what happens if God does exist, and then on these two columns here, if God actually exists, if you believe that God exists and follow him, and it turns out he does exist, there's infinite reward, right? There's nothing can go bad here. There is a God, you believe in him, you give your life to him, eternity is in your grasp. Follow that down to the next box. If you believe that God exists, but it turns out he doesn't exist, you don't lose anything. I mean, people think you're funny, but they probably do anyway. Right? Now, do you get the point there? If you believe that God exists, so we can follow this down with Jesus. If you believe Jesus exists, and it turns out he doesn't, you've given your life to a pretty good thing. and you've lived the best life available. I think almost everyone says that, even people who don't believe in God. See Jesus as this great moral teacher who really we should follow. Now, if we do wager on God, and God exists, if we wager against God, if we say there is no God, and God does exist, that's infinite loss. Because Scripture says that anyone who doesn't become a part of the kingdom is separated from God eternally. So if we say there is no God, and it turns out God does exist, we will be separated from him eternally. Because however your view of eternity works out, we understand that there's clear teaching about the separation that exists between God and those who don't follow him. The clear distinction between those who do not believe in Jesus and what happens to them in the eternity. They're separated from God. If you say there's no God, and it turns out there's no God, doesn't matter, right? Because this is all there is, and we're really truly dead when we're dead here. And so that's kind of the idea. We say, what do we have to lose if we say that Jesus is God and it turns out that he wasn't? What do we have to lose if we say all the evidence seems to point to Jesus as the Messiah, but it turns out he isn't? We lose nothing, because we will have given ourselves to a great life. But if we say, I don't want to follow Jesus, therefore I say he doesn't exist, and it turns out he did, that means eternal separation. So the question is, where are you? The last words that I'm going to give you, again from Jesus in John chapter 14, he says, let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, where I am, you may be also. And you know the way to where I'm going. Thomas said to him, Lord, we do not know where you are going. How can we know the way? And Jesus said, I am the way and the truth and the life. Jesus said to him, no one comes to the Father except through me. If you had known me, you would have known my Father also. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. Jesus says, I am the way, I am the truth, and I am the life, the resurrection and the life. And no one comes to the Father except through me. I think we could sit on our doubts for a long time. I said it's not a bad thing to doubt. But sometimes we're lazy. We say things about our doubts without really searching it out. What you find out about Lee Strobel and people like C.S. Lewis is they started out trying to prove that it wasn't true, and they turned out believing that it was. And so the question for us today is, where are we? What do you say about Jesus? Because what you say about Jesus is what matters in your faith and your journey. And so that question is, do you believe Jesus is the Savior, the only way? Is he the truth? Is he life? And if not, what more do you need? What other evidence do you need? If you're like, I'm still not convinced. Okay, what do you need? Because on the basis of just what I've, not as quickly as I had hoped to, presented to you, there's a lot of evidence. What for you is the number one evidence for the truth of Jesus? If somebody were to say to you, hey, why do you believe this crazy story? What would you say? Which argument for Jesus do you find the least compelling? How are you going to process this through? What he calls us to is to embrace him as Messiah, as the way, the truth, and the life. And so I want to